Welcome, everyone. Julie here. I am very excited about today's guest. Today, I am welcoming the Honorable Stockwell Day. And I was thinking about how to introduce you, and you have such a litany of political accomplishments in Canada that to mention some of them and not the others seems to do the others disservice. But just to refresh people's memory, you were the leader of the Canadian Alliance from about 2000, 2001, which does not feel that long ago. That's 20 years ago. I can hardly believe that.
I can hardly believe it.
It just seemed like, yeah, it was fresh in my mind. And under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, among other portfolios, you were the Minister of Public Safety. So I want to make sure to ask you a little bit about that later on. So grateful for your time today, but more than that, for your contribution to what I think we really need right now, which is unconstrained public discussion, conversations about ideas that we take to be important, about what's worrying us as Canadians, and about what we're going to do about it together, and not being afraid that we might say the wrong thing, on pain of dissolving our relationship. So that's a public space that's not entirely safe to tread into these days. So I very much appreciate your being with me today.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here with you. You have become a legend in a short period of time, I could tell you. So it's always fun to hang out with legends.
Let's talk a little bit about where we're at. A lot of the things that have happened over the last couple of years, there's been like almost a nomenclature, a language to it that I didn't think we would see in Canada. We have these words that you can't turn on the news without seeing things like mandate, vaccine passports, lockdowns, restrictions. And these were not things that were part of our vocabulary prior to 2020 or 2019. And then not to mention all the other things that people are worried about economically now. We've had a housing crisis for years. Now we're worried about inflation. So many people were still worried about terrorism. And now there's a hysteria over the climate crisis and whatever new virus is on the horizon. I think people are really gripped by a kind of anxiety. And that makes it not surprising that we have things like unprecedented levels of obesity and drug addiction and alcohol addiction and stress, which is a major risk factor for every disease, right? It seems like we're not doing very well. Do you ever wonder, how did we get to this place in Canada?
Well, those are great observations, Julie, if I can call you that, or Dr. Ponesse,
Yes,
whatever.
Julie, of course, Julie.
Yeah, you've been clearly, not just now, but over the last period of time, you've been a clear articulator of this problem. You said something particularly poignant in one of your interviews when you talked about the crisis. You talked about the crisis in healthcare because of what exactly you described, this fear of speaking up. And then you said the crisis in media, which is true, the crisis in academe. And then what really sort of zinged through to my heart was the crisis in the public square, the crisis between people willing to just talk about things, including their differences. That to me is the saddest, but probably the most frightening also, where people are simply afraid to be open and talk about what they think about things for fear of being, you pick the word canceled or whatever. And in response to your question, and you've been a chronicler of this, it's taken a fair bit of time, probably 30 or 40 years to get to this place. But that's just an instant of time in terms of our history of public discourse. It was always acceptable, as a matter of fact, expected that people in any of those arenas that you mentioned would speak up, and there'd be a debate, especially on healthcare, which is supposed to be based on science, and the foundation of science and the scientific method is debate. It's, here's what I think. What do you think? Here's what my tests show. What do your tests show? So the erosion of that ability to be truly free, it's taken some time to build up, but it's come upon us suddenly, and it's put us in a very precarious position as far as our liberties go.
And the death of curiosity, don't you think? You mentioned people just getting together with their loved ones or having conversations, or, how can you have a conversation with your friends, say over coffee in the morning at the local coffee shop, if you either don't have curiosity about who they are, what they think about things, what their views are, why they differ from you, what they think about you and your view. If you don't have that curiosity, how is conversation possible? You know?
That's a good question. I think we're seeing the results of that, and again, the heartbreaking uh, consequences of this type of approach, being afraid to speak up. It really it's gone right into families. COVID has been COVID. It wasn't COVID that brought this on, but COVID has highlighted it. I think there's hardly a family that has not been split where you can't even discuss your different point of views,
Mhm.
even in the light of science. You had was it Dr. Bonnie Millard? Correct me if I've got that
Mhm.
correct. Another an amazing woman, 30 years in the business of immunology and virology, recognized around the world and at one of our Canadian universities. And just the fact that she brought a different view to the table related to this whole process, the mandates, etc., she was done. Her career was over. We've lost, at least in the public stream, such a valuable resource. And I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but look at your situation.
Mhm.
Um, a doctor of ethics and in bioethics and a diploma from the Kennedy School on this whole topic. And you brought up a different point of view. And here's what alarms me. You were not just fired by, again, a male dominated hierarchy, but where are the women in journalism who should have been there for you? I mean, men should have been there too.
You're right. I wasn't just fired. I was strung up in the public square as an
You
example.
were.
You better not do this or else. And
You
uh,
were.
you're right. There were no journalists who to act as a check and balance on, I mean, goodness, they should be doing that with government and they haven't, but also
Right.
with academia, and to say, well, what's going on in these little ivory
Right.
wall ecosystems where our ideas are supposed to be free and protected? What's happening there anyway? Never mind me. I mean, what's being taught to the students who are paying tens of thousands of dollars
Right.
per year and orienting their lives around this idea that you can't live a good life without an undergraduate degree? What are they learning anyway? And what is
No,
the output of our academic work in journals and studies? And what value does that have? Right?
exactly right. Everything but the prevailing narrative gets diminished. I mean, going back to to the journalists, I know most of the leading journalists in Canada. Interviewed with them. You get to know people when you're on the Hill for years,
Mhm.
and I've always had such respect for them. They're articulate. They're you would think they're well informed. But recently, when it comes to giving coverage to somebody who has a different approach, they go silent. Now, I'd like to, it'd be great. I'm not telling you how to run your show, but you get, Rosemary Barton on your show or Lisa LaFlamme, some of these names and say, I would like to know, have they been ordered by the, again, male dominated hierarchy in journalism to just plain shut up when you see the heartbreaking situation of someone like Dr. Julie Ponesse getting thrown under the bus? They they've they run for cover, and I'd like to know from their point of view, why is that? I understand the fear of being canceled, especially in business. When I was so-called canceled, be over 2 years ago now, just with the loss of multi-year contracts that I had, that's you know the results of that over a number of years is in the millions of dollars. So I get that. I get that people are afraid to speak up.
Mhm.
But as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, you begin to die the day you stop speaking up. And we have a dying culture of openness because, and in this case, we're talking about journalists and journalists now, are afraid to push back with their editors. Editors are afraid to push back with their publishers. And it's put us in a very precarious state as a civilization.
Well, I sure am glad we were chatting today. We could just stop right there, and that's given us so many nuggets to think about. Can you take us back? You mentioned 30 or 40 years ago, the seeds of where we're at now got planted, got nurtured. That takes us back to the early 80s, maybe the late 70s. What did you see, or in hindsight, see that was happening in Canada that sort of trickled in, infiltrated into, I guess, politics, academia, journalism, the culture?
Mm.
How
That's a
did that
great
happen? Where
question.
did that come from?
Let me just toss out my thesis on that, and you can agree or disagree. I guess we're allowed to disagree on stuff on your show.
I think
Um,
so. Let me check in the back of the book and the manual. I'll let you know.
you said 30, 40 years ago. So when I got first elected in provincial legislature in Alberta, and I served variously as I was Minister of Labor and then Minister of Social Services and then Finance Minister, debate was robust in those days,
Mm.
even with, the NDP in the legislature, with the Liberals, and fiery also. But there was certain nomenclatures that never were introduced into the vocabulary, the lexicon of the debate. For instance, if somebody had a different point of view that I did in debate, we never used the word, we never accused the person of being hateful, for instance.
Right.
You're a hater. We never said denier. We never said racist. Are there racists out there? Of course there are. And there's people who need to be deemed as such when it arises. But we never use terms like that. We say, I disagree. We say you're out to lunch. And not just formally, but I can remember even sitting around the legislature. I can remember a Muslim friend of mine, and we would talk about our differences and what we believe spiritually. Now, those are pretty profound differences.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we would talk about them. He would say, well, I don't think Jesus Christ is Lord, let's say, as the Christian denomination thinks. And I'd say, well, I have some thoughts about Muhammad. And we could have those discussions, and not in secret, but openly. But more and more, we got into the way you silence people is call them a hater, call them a denier, use some of these terms, and then it becomes reputational. And then people start to fear that they're going to lose either status or maybe a sponsor or some reputation. That is what began to change.
That's so interesting because, I mean, what you're talking about is an ad hominem attack, right? You're attacking a person's character,
Right.
fiber of their being, what it is that makes them. It's very personal. I think when you attack someone's words, what they say, what claims they make, there's a certain, it's not that we're not connected to our utterances or our expressions, but there's a bit of a distance there. But when you bypass those views and you go right to the heart of the person, we saw this with our prime minister in the House with Melissa Lastman in particular, and then of course, demonizing the truckers and anyone who supported them, that there's no engagement. I mean, he's famous for this. There's no engagement with the things said, just bypassing it. It's masterful in terms of, if we think of rhetoric as just a matter of persuading people, but there's no substance to it. Because if you just go back and forth and attack a person's character, as I said, it's very personal, but also I think as you're pointing out, there's no political debate anymore. There's no public, because you're not talking about anything. You're not talking about ideas. You're talking about people and what's important politically and ideologically and culturally are the ideas that we have, right? So you think that and so even back, so when would that be, in the 90s?
Well, there was still, I would call it, Julie, I would call it relative freedom. Getting into the 80s, moving into the 90s. There were a number of things that came, a number of types of debates that started to emerge that then pushed people to these ugly accusations. I can remember quite clearly the debate on the definition of marriage, for instance. In the early days of that debate, it was openly debated. It was discussed. There were strong feelings on both points of view. Most prime ministers up until that point of time agreed that civil unions should have full rights, absolutely, of any other type of union. But the debate hung around the definition of marriage itself. So you were, an observer of those debates. So in the early days of the debate, we could discuss that and recognize that everybody had the liberty to make their own choices in terms of who they wanted to be with for their lives. But there began to start in there an accusation of hatred. You hate somebody, you're a hater. And I can think, but it usually was leveled to people who were either center or to the right. For instance, when Barack Obama first ran for president, he was very strong. Maintain the definition of marriage, maintain the definition, allow civil unions. Jean Chrétien, very strong on that, maintain that. But suddenly there began to emerge that if you had a different view on this, you were deemed a hater. And that graduated, not just in that debate, there was a couple of others that embraced this thought, but it got to the place that you should not actually be allowed even to speak in public. If you remember the vote, the final vote in the House of Commons on that particular question, it was nearly split. It was almost 50-50. But it went to the side that said, no, let's change the definition. And, everybody voted and we moved on. We said, okay, well, that's democracy. Bring forward your point of view, have a good debate. All right, it goes the other way. But now, and now, things like that continue to get dredged up. They bring back things people have said, many, many years ago and said, well, it just proves you're a hater. So hater, racist, misogynist. I was so disappointed. So many times you bring up Prime Minister Trudeau and Melissa Lantsman, a little tough to call her a misogynist, by the way.
And yet, or a Nazi, and yet.
Exactly right. That's a little tough one, right?
Yeah.
But I think of, that's why I sort of smile when I don't want to get a partisan thing here, but the federal leadership race that's going on now, I'm supporting Leslyn Lewis. And so I'm waiting to see, I'd love to see a debate with the Prime Minister and Leslyn Lewis. I'd love to see him try to call her misogynist. Or how about racist? How about anti-immigration? She came here. So those will be fun moments to watch. But what's not fun is the fact that people have had lives, they've had destroyed, they've had their reputations destroyed, careers destroyed, like yours, because it's gone to this new level. You don't want to entertain debate. Call somebody a denier instead. Call them racist instead. And then, you know what? With the
Shut
media
them up and
on
then
top,
walk out of the house, right? Isn't that a good tactic?
Exactly right. Yeah. So all of that has contributed to the fear of what you're going to lose. And you mentioned, Nazi and things like that. Even if you bring up terms like that today, or what went on in the 30s and 40s, even then you're saying, oh, you're trying to diminish the terrible events of that time. And no, not at all. But there are certain precursors that can be seen to lead to the type of society where freedoms are taken away. So now I'll talk about Napoleon. His famous quote. He said, "I will lose my empire if I cease to become fearsome." So he knew you've got to strike fear, whether you use it with a COVID narrative or whether you use it with fear of being accused of something. That is basically the instrument. Strike fear and then protect your empire. And sad to say that Prime Minister Trudeau and a number of other leaders around the world are using that tactic.
Causing fear. I mean, it's one thing for fear to exist in a population because of a reasonable concern over a threat, but causing fear in a population out of proportion with the threat, or where there is no threat, that is a kind of hatred, isn't it? I mean, that's a way to express hatred for people. You mentioned sort of hatred coming from the left. I think that's very interesting. This idea that, I mean, hatred is, if we call it an emotion, of kind of a moral emotion, that falls on partisan lines, that it was out of the left camp that hating came launched to those on the right, and the right have kind of assumed, and maybe quite reasonably so. I mean, what else are you going to do? But have kind of taken a defensive position, because when you're constantly hated, I mean, that's a lot to deal with. It's a barrage, right? An attack. How do you think that narrative, or that sort of, what can we call it? Those sort of dispositions relative to how do we change that? How do we take hatred out of the political sphere and get it focused on the ideas again, the issues, not make it personal?
Yeah, well, I think part of the answer that, Julie, is we've got to go after and hold to account the activists in all of these movements, be they to the left or be to the right. Most of the people, let's say in a particular group, most would tend to be more reasonable than their activist leaders. And so we've really got to call out the leaders when they're using that type of language. I can remember, well, not to prolong this issue, but on the marriage debate, I remember when I was running for leadership federally, and there was a great story it was either Toronto Star or Globe Mail, I believe it, I keep it, I've got it recorded, where the media went to one of the leaders of, it was one of the gay and lesbian associations, and said, wow, Stockwell Day's running for federal leadership. You must be worried about a hater like that. And this guy said, well, no, this is not about hate. As a matter of fact, Stockwell Day used to meet with us regularly to try and, understand our position and make sure he had, a full understanding. And so we disagree, but he's not a hater. That got one quick mention, and then that was never brought up again. So it's because there's a person who I would say is strong in that in their movement and in their community, but not an activist who's trying to scare off debate by using those terms. So you have to go after the activists. I can tell you, Julian, I made this observation early on in my political career. So people are going to think I'm being stereotypical here, but I'm just giving an observation. Traveling around, not just in a province, but around the country, holding political meetings, open public meetings. The most aggressive, the most attack-minded people, the most disruptive was always the people on the left. Not that there aren't some people on the right who aren't like that, there are, but the predominance, the worst demonstrations, the worst attacks, physical attacks, either on me or on my team. I can think of times when my wife and I literally attacked by a mob. We're reading lately about politicians, and this is very serious business, who have death threats. You know what? I regularly, and people to the right of the spectrum, regularly, death threats, bombing threats, people arrested because of credible threats. It almost always came from the left, not that the right is immune to it. And so you've got to really got to zero in who's saying this, which activists are saying it, and hold them to account for their bigoted attacks.
Let's talk about the political spectrum for a little bit, because I'm quite frequently confused by it, to be honest. We have this language of left and right, center, left, right, and center. We have this language of conservative versus liberal. Do those map on to each other, do you think? I mean, when we talk about someone being on the right, do we necessarily mean that they are conservative? Is it possible to be a right-leaning liberal?
It actually is. It actually is. And on
Let's
some
get
points,
this sorted out once and for all.
so you and I may have some of the same discomfort with the use of labels. However, labels are, at least on the surface, sometimes helpful, right? So if I say I'm from the right politically, basically what I'm saying is I believe in the importance of individuals, I believe in the importance of families, I believe in the importance of small business. And I believe in the necessity of government to a degree in our lives, obviously.
So that just sounds to me like being Canadian and being rational.
Well, thank you for saying that. I would have thought that. But now the term, if you say you're center right, or, you're pretty well going to be excoriated, at least in the public arena. The left tends to want more government in their lives, more government control. And that's why they don't push back on a number of things that the right would push back on. So yes, we need regulations. Yes, we need taxation. Obviously, we need these type of things to run governments. But when you say you're from the right, you're highlighting your importance, the sense of importance you have on individual human beings. The more you get to the left, of course, then you get to Napoleon, or you get to, let's say, present day leaders who say, I'm the state. L'état c'est moi, I'm the one. And again, I don't want to pick on poor old Napoleon, but it's been noted of him. First, he had to destroy personal liberties. Then he exhausted the resources of his country. So the first step is destroying those liberties. So if you're at the place now where you are afraid to say, yeah, I'm to the right of the spectrum, then your voice is going to be diminished. You're only going to hear from so-called the left. That'll become the prevailing narrative. And people who are in what I would call the mushy middle just go, well, that's the only view we hear. So it must be the quote right view, even though it's the left perspective.
One of the things I'm working through trying to understand this is, I think my perception of undemocratic regimes of the past. So whether we're talking about a dictatorship or an abusive monarchy or any kind of sort of dominating system, is that of course the subjects would have desired freedom but had it limited. Of course there would be a tension between the subjects wanting freedom and their leader not wanting freedom. But the thing that I think has become clear over the last couple of years is we don't have a majority of people in Canada who desire to live free individual lives and just feel that constrained at different points. We have people whose spirit for freedom it's growing weak, it's growing tiresome, it feels selfish. You're accused of being selfish, and I'm very interested in whether or not, I mean, has freedom ever been Canadian? Is that part of our identity? Is it an American value that somehow got incorporated into our Constitution? What is it? I guess my question is, what is it to be Canadian? And are we right to think that freedom is an essential component of that identity?
Oh, I believe we are, and I appreciate you raising that, because I mean, even the mottos of some of our provinces, strong and free,
Right.
freedom being a core value. Often we hear Sir Wilfrid Laurier talking about freedom. So that has been. It's not as pronounced in the U.S. because, as your viewers would know, when the colonists, so-called, made the decision that they were going to rebel against the king because they were being grossly taxed, overly regulated, freedom of speech was gone, and they said, we've appealed, it's not worked, so now we're going to fight. Well, a number of those colonists still had allegiance to the king and said, no, we're out of here, and we're moving north to this place, these couple of provinces called Canada, because they still respected the king, they respected the monarchy, they didn't mind so much paying the big taxes, and they didn't want to fight. They still wanted freedom, but now it was a hybrid type of freedom. When I go back generationally, my grandfather, my great grandfather, were from the eastern seaboard, and my mother's side of the family were among what we call so those people who didn't want to fight the king. They wanted to be loyal to the empire. They were the United Empire Loyalists. So my mother's side of the family said, no, we're out of here. And they moved left. They, like, as I would say to her, your folks, your side love paying taxes and love taking orders. But so I'm a bit, when I come to tax policy and things like that, I'm a bit schizophrenic, I guess, because I've got this dual stream in my DNA. But we Canadians were still very much freedom oriented, but in a little more of a subjective, and I use that, subjecting themselves still to the monarchy and thinking we could achieve responsible government by moving along incrementally, which largely we did. And credit to the Canadian model. But freedom, I mean, there was no issue. First World War, calling on all those soldiers to rise to the occasion. Our troops are known at Dieppe and Vimy Ridge, and Second World War. We respond significantly. But there is an effort, and there has been in the last, again, maybe it's 30, 40 years, to diminish that importance of individual freedom, and to somehow incorporate a new view of Canada, which is relatively new, that we actually all want to be socialists. Well, I think that is increasing. The more you give money to people and they don't have to work, the more they're going to tend to want to continue to see that. You give a grant and then try and take that away. That just doesn't happen in politics. So unfortunately, by this ongoing buyout of Canadians, and that would include buying out businesses, people are literally being bought out to forego some of what used to be individual freedom and just say, you know what, as long as I'm getting my payments and as long as I got a roof over my head and as long as I got my cell phone and the internet, yeah, I'm basically good. I feared that's where we're drifting.
You are quite a student of history. And I bring that up because it seems to me that we don't hear about history very much anymore. If anything, history is a threat. You mentioned the common response to invoking references to the Holocaust or any other atrocities of the past, and that feeling like a threat, or it's inappropriate, or it's a poor argument from analogy, or whatever it is, or it diminishes the experience of the people who went through those things. so someone who taught in university for a long time and now following what's driving much of this narrative, the idea that you follow the science to the exclusion of everything else. But science without an understanding of humanity, without understanding of history, without empathy, without curiosity, without all of these things that we learn from the models of the past, right? And the past teaches us not just maybe how to live better, but what happens when we err in certain ways, right? What happens when we let our weaknesses go unchecked? What happens when we elect the wrong kind of leader, the wrong kind of government? Do you think, and I don't remember in recent history when I have heard a politician refer to or make any kind of historical reference to Canadian politicians of the past or anything else. Do you think it's therefore not a coincidence that we've gotten here because we have leaders who see themselves, I guess, subconsciously or consciously as disjointed from the past or as better than the past, as above the past, as not needing to make reference? And then a bigger question is that's a failing of our school system too. Do you think?
Huge. Boy, you've really zeroed in on the education system. That's where we have really, we've really lost the battle. Up until I was canceled, I had a regular gig at one of, a couple of Canada's universities. I won't mention either of them because I don't want them to get in trouble now. So I would start the discussion. This one course, it was a credit course, and it was for postgrad students. So they had to show up. So I had a captive audience, and it was usually a 2-day course. And so I was actually alarmed, Julie, I can tell you, because one day I was just making a side reference to the Magna Carta. And I saw this sort of blank look among all these students. And these are smart, articulate students. They're in their mid-20s. They're passionate about what they believe. I had to take about an hour out of the class and explain some of these basic things about where the Magna Carta came from and where some of our basic rights to this day, habeas corpus, And, I would say, what's this got to do with a corpse, So you're right. The education system has been, and again, among those who design the courses, deliberately, and I say this deliberately, delinquent in reminding people about past historical examples that lead to tragedy. When I talk to sometimes friends of my grandkids, I won't say my grandkids, and my grandkids span all ages, and the odd time, I mentioned, for instance, say the Holocaust, they're sort of, what was that? And I go, well, you know what the Holocaust is, right? Not really. These are kids in their teens, and I get alarmed at that. I feel very honored that just a couple of years ago I was honored by B'nai B'rith for my stand for Israel and for some of the things that are going on and how we should be supporting them. And yet sometimes when I talk about these things, I just get blank stares. They literally are not informed, and not just the event, the horrific events themselves, but what led up to them, that are common in all societies that are eventually taken over by rabid dictators. There's a series of things that has to happen first, and building fear about speaking out is definitely one of the building blocks that has to take place before you can oversee something as horrific as the destruction of a nation or a destruction of an entire group of people.
One question I think that's on a lot of people's minds right now is whether we're at the end of something or just at the beginning of something. Are we is this after a storm or the beginning of a superstorm, or are we having a pause between two storms? And I think you're quite right. But, teaching that, understanding the precursors to losses of freedom in the past, to totalitarian control, whatever we want to call it, understanding those precursors, that takes a lot of nuance, I think, and because you have to read beyond the event itself, right? You're interested in what led up to the Holocaust. There are lots of books on the Holocaust or lots of books on Nazism, but understanding what was going on in the culture in the 20s in Europe.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Right. That's a difficult thing that I think not a lot probably of historians even or teachers of history are well versed to do. But that doesn't mean we should shy away from the work of that. But it's maybe not surprising that so many of us are not in tune to the similarities between what's going on now and what has happened in the past. Right.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and I don't want to sound like I'm blaming all the ills on media, though I am. um, but you mentioned the 20s and the 30s, when the so-called Soviet experiment was being unrolled, and Marxist Leninist as it was, and being enforced by physical force. Now we've got cultural Marxism, which is actually just as terrifying. But it could only have happened by people getting to the place where they're completely terrified of speaking up, and they were just eliminated. But the media and the philosophers of the day, and you would be aware of this as a philosopher, of course, Bertrand Russell and others who would actually go. They actually went to the Soviet Union. They wanted to see if it worked, and they came back telling the lie. They said, we have seen the future and it works. And so the entire Western population, Canada, US, Europe, we're going, well, maybe, yeah, it's not great, but maybe it's not so bad. No, it's horrific. It is evil. And that evil was covered up to a large degree, and it still is, by some of the so-called, some of the icons of culture, by not exposing it. I was in, it's not just Soviet Union, just a couple of years ago, I was in Cuba. I was there with a group that was helping small individual farms, helping farmers get started, basically, seed production and raising chickens and things like that. Cuba is a disaster when it comes to standard of living, healthcare, empty shelves everywhere. Once you get out of Havana, which is bad enough as it is, it's terrible. The Cuban people, the ones we met, are wonderful. But you talk about living in fear and being afraid to speak up. But again, the media, anytime Canadian journalists go to Cuba, they talk about, oh, isn't it quaint? They love the old cars. They love driving around in the old 56 Chevys. Isn't that quaint? That's not quaint. They've been denied technology. They're not allowed to get ahead. By their own ingenuity, they're allowed to they figure out ways to keep these old cars coming. Right. So the failure of media to be honest about what some of these socialist regimes have wrought has been one of the significant factors in our own populations being totally misled by the swan song of socialism, for instance, and then eventually the power that it takes to force that on people through fear.
I have no doubt about it, that you're right, that the media has fueled and created this machine, this fear generating machine. No challenge to that view. But I do wonder, what is it that makes that possible? Surely people, the populace, has to be in a place where they're vulnerable to that level of hysteria. And I wonder a lot lately about, in philosophy, in academia, we talk about postmodernism, kind of this free fall after this claim that, nothing has meaning. Everything we believed in for the longest time is just empty. And I think that's trickled down culturally. I mean, far fewer people now, and I don't want to pin all of this on religion, but, or even Christianity or Judaism per se, but I think far fewer people now than ever before self-identify as being religious.
Right.
And religion is a big source of meaning, right? Whether it's true or false, whether you, regardless of the particulars of your religion, it gives you purpose and meaning. You live life for a reason. You do, you structure your life for certain reasons. Do you think that we sort of have a crisis of meaning? And this is maybe not unique to Canada. I mean, this is, quite possibly a global phenomenon, but I mean, is it a loss of religion? Is it a loss of meaning more generally in our lives? And that what we're doing is trying to, we're in this terrible state of fear, in part because we lack meaning, but because we're in a terrible state of fear, we want to feel better. So we want connections with other people, and those connections we think will be meaningful. So we submit to this collectivist group idea and do whatever the group says and sacrifice ourselves for the group, without realizing that it's not really the trade-off, or the payoff is not the meaning we thought we were going to get.
Well, I think that's, a great insight there. And religion in and of itself, belief in a God, does have the transcending effect of causing people to think there's maybe some rights and some wrongs. There's maybe some evil and some good.
Yes, it's
And the
very handy
importance of,
ethically.
right, well, it can be handy, so it can be utilitarian. I had a grandmother say, God will get you, well, that's not a proper expression, I don't think, of who God is, but it has a utilitarian value.
Yeah.
But even Machiavelli, in his advice to the prince, basically said, listen, even if you're not religious, you got to look religious for the people. You got to look religious.
Yeah.
But there was some profound truth in that, because someone like myself, for a lot of my younger life, I didn't believe that there could be a possibility of a divine being. Of course, I do believe that now. That has a moderating effect on individual behavior. If it has a moderating effect on individual behavior, that'll spread out to the family, that spreads out to the community. And so there is this moderating effect. And when you then dispense with that, and whether you're talking about, as we recently had a federal cabinet minister call the Abrahamic beliefs, which apparently are not going to be allowed anymore to be expressed in our armed forces. Once you take that away, you do have a much more of might is right. Religion was and still is in many cases the basis for the rule of law. For instance, just the notion there could be a law that is actually above you, that is beyond you, and that will regulate our social behavior. When that gets diminished, you really do have chaos begins to ensue, and then it's just the most powerful person or group that will control everybody else. And I don't say that just to say we should keep religion because it's got great utilitarian value. I say it because I believe it's true, but it is also true that when you depart from any sense there could be some absolute right and wrongs, you start to really open yourself up to what eventually is going to be the strongest person or group will be the one that rules, and it's no longer tolerance. It's no longer toleration, it's domination.
That's a haunting phrase, isn't it? The death of religion, it creates a vacuum, doesn't it? And something has to fill that. And
Right.
maybe this has always been true. I mean, maybe societies that have lost religion, have become less religious, always fill it with a kind of group control, a kind of a scrambling for domination. Maybe that's always been the case. One thing I want to ask you about is our separatist tendencies. We've been Quebec and the rest of Canada, there's been that for a long time. But it seems like more and more now we're hearing about East and West. And, I'm being annoyed with him, though many of us were. Jason Kenney from the West probably should have stood up for the West much sooner than he did, because there's definitely a palpable freedom movement there that was not represented politically, I think, that's how it looks from the East anyway. Do you think that this kind of separatist tendency is inescapable for Canadians? Will we either separate somehow in the future, or will we just have this constant desire to do so? I mean, I guess what that is a failure to be able to get along, isn't it, fundamentally? Or a failure to see ourselves as one thing?
Well, you're right. And unfortunately, the East-West divide is accentuated by irresponsible, especially federal leadership. So when the list of grievances grows in a region, then that can be whipped up into separatist tendency. I really believe that even in Alberta, which is probably a leader in this, I think, Julie, if it came right down to it, I don't think you would get 50% of the vote. I don't even think it would, 50% plus one, as happened in Quebec. I think you get 30. I think you get in the 30s. And if the tensions continue to mount, it could get higher. The answer is to allow for the regions to truly stand up for themselves and to say, look, we're different. And so we want some different social policy at the federal level. We want some different economic policy. We still want to get along in this family called Canada. But if at the federal level, as is happening right now, if the Liberals continue to want to squash and crush some of the unique differences with our regions, they are only going to whip up this sentiment. And when I was Minister of Finance, for instance, we'd have provincial finance minister meetings. I would always ally with whoever the Quebec Minister of Finance was, Bernard Landry at the time, because those guys in Quebec and women, they understood this area of autonomy. And yes, they played both sides of the fence. They knew how to get the best out of Canada, but also maintain their own autonomy. So that's really the answer, is to, and yeah, I think Jason Kenney got somewhat overwhelmed by events with COVID and everything else. But if federal leaders don't recognize that the true health of a country comes with allowing differences to flourish, then this sentiment is going to continue to rise. It's going to be very harmful, very counterproductive.
So many of the people, maybe all of the people I've talked to who have fled Canada recently to move to the States, give the same answer to explain why they're doing it. And they say because the particular American states have more autonomy than the provinces in Canada do. And so even though they may not agree with the president, with the federal government in the states, they feel that if they go to a particular state, there's more autonomy. Do you think we need to move towards that model in Canada more, such that Alberta can have more autonomy from the federal government, or Ontario can have more autonomy from the federal government? And then would we need a change in the voting system to make that possible?
I do. I think that's really key to the answer. And unfortunately, I mean, Canada was designed that way. If you remember, John A. Macdonald wanted to get more provinces involved in this thing called Canada. And so he had to make big promises to provinces. He says, look, if you come in, we're going to let you do this. We're going to let you do that. I'll build a railway to, so everybody can link up together. Clearly in the US, being a group of United States, that is far more evident. I was down in Florida in the fall for a while, and I'll tell you, the people who are streaming into Florida from states that have a different political view, and I think that's beautiful. The whole thing should come down to choice. In Florida, I remember getting there, and people would say to me, "Hey, isn't it great? COVID's over." And I went, "Okay."
Not where I come from.
Yeah, okay, COVID's over.
You know who our premier is?
Right.
Yeah.
But you look at the way, for instance, there's a number of governors doing this, but Governor DeSantis seems to be getting quite a bit of attention. The way he stands up to certain federal policies. And he said, hey, here in Florida, we're doing it this way. So Canada was designed that way. And I remind people, we are a confederation. We are not a fed. We weren't designed as a fed. We're a confederation. And we were originally designed to be able to not just allow, but to celebrate these differences. But again, over the last, you pick the number of years, it's this crushing, suffocating effect that comes from the center, that comes from Ottawa, saying no. Now they've allowed significant autonomy in Quebec, as they should. But for instance, on any variety of policy, provinces need to be allowed to express their differences. If you don't, the divide is going to get greater. I still don't think, and I think this is what the feds often realize. I think at the end of the day, they know, you know what? At the end of the day, those Albertans, 51% of them aren't going to vote to leave. So let's just keep crushing the dissidents there. It's a horrible approach to governing, and it should simply stop, and people should truly be respected for their different views, individually, community-wise, and provincially.
The precise moment I realized that the fabric of Canada was changing was on the campaign trail, when Trudeau, with such hatred, red face, pulsing veins, said, "Don't think you're getting on a plane next to a vaccinated person."
Exactly.
Do you know what I thought in that moment? I thought, well, he just lost the election. Canadians aren't going to stand for that. I think that won him the election, because whether or not he's driving it or reflecting it, that kind of hatred and division is palpable, isn't it, today? And that's what we need to address, right? Where that's coming from. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it really is. It's thriving at a level that's very concerning. And yes, you can see, as he's calling people haters, you can see the hatred. And one of his ministers just said last week, the whole thing about keeping unvaccinated people off planes was to force them to get vaccinated. It had nothing to do with the science. And you're right. I was shocked, actually, as you are. I thought, well, that'll expose, just that hateful look. No, his campaign of fear was successful enough that now people, including in my own family, said, you're trying to kill me. You are actually trying to kill me. Complete repudiation of the science on the issue. But it's motivating people through fear. I mean, look, just in the last 2 days, you've had one study showing the 50, I think it said a 54% increase among 17 to 21-year-olds in different problems with the heart related to the vaccine. And then yesterday, one of the key players at the FDA, this isn't an anti-vax person, said, you know what, it's true. Among 5 to 11-year-olds, yes, there's been a 5-fold increase in heart problems for those who get vaccinated. But, they actually kind of said this 5-fold really is not that big a deal. Excuse me, I was forced to learn a bit of math when I was finance minister. I'm still not great at it. But
Give
fivefold
us
is
a math lesson.
fivefold is 500%. And, I've got grandkids in that age range, and I don't tell my kids and beautiful daughters-in-law what to do, but I do say, please consider this. Your kids, 5 to 11, they have more risk of dying driving to school than they do of dying from contracting COVID at school. But you drive them every day. And the risk of them getting the vax, the risk of heart problems among that age group has gone up in the last few years 500%. And I just say, please, just consider this. Please consider it.
Well, these are words we don't hear anymore. Please think about this. Please consider this. I mean, this is not really welcome advice, I think, we're told not to think about things, not to consider things. And I'm wondering we've talked about a lot of the worst parts of humanity over the last while. We've talked about hatred and division and Napoleon and the Holocaust. And I'm asking you to sort of look in your crystal ball, but where do you think we're going to be next year or a decade from now when your 8-year-old grandchild is going off to university or at that age? What do you think Canada will look like?
Well, when you start talking about grandkids, you're getting to the core of my heart here. And I've always been an optimist at heart, but I want to tell you that in different presentations I've made in the last couple of years, I'm losing the optimism in terms of our hope of a truly freewheeling, prosperous society. And, they say the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that the pessimist usually has more information. So there's reasons for—
So it's not pessimism, it's realism then.
Exactly right. So for Canada, I'm entirely pessimistic? No. Leaning much more to pessimism? Yes. You mentioned business people. The federal government is 100% in denial over the number of, and I'm not talking about big corporate entities, I'm talking about family businesses, small businesses that are right now moving and have already moved out of the country. When financial assets leave a country, that country becomes increasingly impoverished. We are on the road to Venezuela in Canada. I was just talking with a business couple, and their accountant is from Venezuela. And she has said to them a number of times just recently, do Canadians not see where their country is headed with this government that just, number one, promises them everything and is spending without limits and also building fear at the same time? And she said, can Canadians not see this? I talked to another family that took their entire business, because now we can be very fluid in terms of where our businesses are. I can do my business anywhere in the world. And this family had moved to Croatia. And they say, we love it here. They haven't, their school system is much better. They haven't gone woke crazy. People are allowed to celebrate their differences, but we don't dominate and try and ram our differences into their lifestyle. It's a much, much more respectful society. And once you're in Croatia and work towards getting a passport after a few years, you've got your ticket to the entire EU. Similar people are saying that, people whose families came from, let's say, Eastern Europe in the 20s and 30s and went where there was still freedom in South America and Central America. Now their kids who've become successful and are losing their savings and losing the ability to be entrepreneurial. They're restructuring and they're finding themselves in Central America. They're finding great spots of freedom in South America. And the federal government they're in denial. They know it's happening, but they don't want to admit it's happening. They actually like the prospect of us becoming impoverished Venezuela, because when you're impoverished as a people, you are completely dominated by the governing forces.
And economics is not as far removed from morality and relationships and non-financial things as we might think, because when you control someone's ability to earn and keep their money, you control much of their power in the world and the opportunities that you have in life. And so we might think of these things as separate, as belonging to different portfolios in the government, for example, but in actual fact, economic decisions, what we do with our money, what our government does with our money, have a very big impact and trickle down into all facets of our lives. And maybe most significantly, I think impact people's sort of daily mental health, right? If we're worried, I spoke to someone last night who said, I'm priced out of the housing market in Toronto and I don't see myself ever getting in. Well, that's not just about having a financial asset, right? That's also about having
Right,
a home, having stability, having
right.
something you can work on that's yours, that you take pride in. And so I think it isn't surprising that, as you mentioned, people from Venezuela looking at us saying, don't you see what you're doing to yourselves, not just economically, but yourselves, generally speaking. What do you think people, I mean, these are big, big issues, big topics we're
Right.
talking about today. They're grand, they're global, many of them. What do you think people can do? You know, I'm going to get up on a Wednesday morning. I need to make some decisions about my life. I need to make decisions about, you know, my job and my bank account and my relationships with my friends and my children. And what do people do on the micro scale now to start
Mm.
moving out of this towards something more hopeful?
Well, the number of people that want to do that, or let's say that are motivated to do that, are because that large number is diminishing, and it's because the government is continuing to move in and literally buying people at all levels, paying them, making the payments, and so people start to give up. There's a level at which you, me, others, there's a level at which we will capitulate and say to the government, yeah, okay, I'm just going to let you run it and do what you want. I just want, a few of the creature comforts, and I want to be warm in the winter and have my house and have the internet, have my rented house. So for many people, and I say this in a heartbroken way, many people who are so-called homeless, living on the streets, that level of government support to which they will basically say, yeah, I'm giving up, it's comparatively low. If they get a couple thousand a month, as many of them do, they're willing to say, you know what, life is tough and I'm willing to settle for this. And I'm out here in BC right now and I see them all, and so many of them in their tents down by the water, and there's some tragic stories there, but they're willing to basically capitulate for 2,000. I wouldn't capitulate for 2,000, but if the government said to me, you know what, Stock, you've been working hard all your life. How about for 2 million a year, you just sort of step out, do what you like, but don't get involved anymore. Yeah, I hate to say it, they might get me at 2 million. So what about 100,000? There's a lot of people who will cop out at 100,000, some at 50,000. And so as the government continues to subsidize you as an individual or businesses individually, the will to stand up and make our own way begins to diminish. It. We become much more malleable as a population. And in the famous words of Klaus Schwab over at the World Economic Forum, and I'm not a conspirator on that, by the way, the World Economic Forum, they're wide open. They actually do believe that the world will be better when we just control it with a few elite. And the rest of us poor bumbling souls, they're going to take care of us. They actually do believe that. So there's nothing hidden or conspiratorial about it. And in his own words, he said when he was talking about Canada, he said, listen, you're going to get to the place where you will own nothing, you will rent, and you will be happy. And I think there's a prophetic impulse in what he said, whether he intended it to be that way, but he was appealing. That's appealing to the dark side of human nature, which we all have. There is a point which we're willing to shrug and say, you know what, it means I could lose my reputation and my livelihood. I'm just shutting up. Or it means I should pursue these various freedoms and highlight them and speak about them. No, I'm just going to lose everything, so I'm just going to be quiet. So that's why I'm somewhat pessimistic, at least in Canada, not giving up, but more and more of our population is saying, I'm good with that. Just cover everything for me, and I rent, and you know what? I'll be happy. I'm very concerned about the growth of those numbers in Canada.
It's a testament to the strain of modern life, though, isn't it? If we're that willing to give up our integrity, our identity, everything for the sake of money and security, doesn't that say something about how strained and worried we are and struggling and, paddling quickly underwater in order to keep all the, all the ducks in the row, mixing metaphors of various kinds there, I think. But, I think we're probably back to where we were earlier in the conversation about meaning. If you're willing to trade off, sell off yourself for money, what have you got left? You might not have, you might be able to, as you say, cover your rent, buy food, but for what purpose? To what end? For what relationships? And human beings are, I think back to the philosophers I love, Plato and Aristotle, the ancients, 2,000 years plus. I think we've understood that flourishing and happiness comes from seeing the value of our agency in the world. We're not perfect all the time. We don't always get it right. We misstep, but we can see that we have an effect on the world. And then the sense of response that feeds back into our sense of responsibility. And hopefully we get up the next day and say, I'm going to try and do that a little bit better today. You take pride in that growth, right? And I think I'm quite compelled by your thesis that the World Economic Forum is not conspiratorial, because it sounds very good. We'll take care of you and you will be happy. I don't know if that claim, you will be happy, is descriptive or instructive. I don't know if he means, I think by that you'll be happy, or you better be happy because we've given you all of this. I don't know, maybe it's a bit of both. But that's a world in which we've lost meaning. And who are we as humans if we don't have meaning in our lives?
Well, you've picked up on the nuance. You will be happy,
on pain of not being happy.
Exactly right. And that's the very disconcerting thing. I mean, you've done some great publishing on your studies on Aristotle, and he talked about happiness in the true meaning of the word. And it was a happiness that was not derived by caving into imperial forces, though those existed.
Or reputation, the desire.
Or reputation, yeah. So it comes back to fear. You talk about people in fear. So I've had wonderful opportunity, and I'm very thankful for it over the years in government and then the private sector, to meet with so many boards of organizations, both in the private sector and the philanthropic sector. People who've worked hard, earned their way onto these board positions, and CEOs of large company. I can tell you, and obviously I would never name names, at the board level, large corporate boards and the CEO level, you might be surprised, I don't know if you would be, at the level of fear there, where they've said, you know what, I don't believe the world is going to end because of global warming. At 9 o'clock on July 1st, 9:30 in Newfoundland, I don't believe it's going to end then. But if I say I don't believe it, man, it's going to cost us contracts. We're going to lose business. They're going to say I'm some kind of a denier. So even at, with intelligent, highly educated, successful people, this fear factor, they know better. They know there's, just like a global warming itself, they know there's an appropriate way to look at how best to deal with emission controls and things like that. But shutting down our entire energy sector, they know that's wrong. They know it's going to hurt the environment in the long run, because we can't get China then off of its coal. We can't get Ukraine off of, and Europe off of its dependence. They know it's wrong. I've talked to them for years. I'd say, gentlemen and women, you've got to speak up. People listen to you. No, we're bidding on a big contract right now. We will lose that contract if we don't completely bow down to not the fact that global warming isn't something that should be looked at. It should. But if we're not declaring this is pretty well a state of emergency, and telling our kids and grandkids that it's pretty well over unless we shut down anything to do with oil and gas, then I'm going to lose my contract, my job, and my position. That's huge in the private sector. It's huge in the healthcare sector. So many doctors I've talked to, who I know personally, good friends, And I said, this isn't true. You got to speak up. And they go, you're asking me to speak up. And they'll point to people, other doctors who've been punted out of the system,
Mhm.
sometimes pointing to people like yourself. If I'm talking to my friends in academia, they say, no, it's not worth it. I'm going to be thrown under the bus. I'll lose my home, not going to be able to send my kids to universities. No, I'm not speaking up. If people are so dumb that they want to believe the extremists, that's up to them. But I'm not speaking up. The fear factor, again, it comes back to that. It's huge, even in that highly educated level of society.
Well, I want to take on those academics who are afraid and say it's not worth it. And I can say that being on the other side of being thrown under the bus, it is totally worth it. I wouldn't have had the chance to talk to you today and have this, I think, fascinating conversation if I hadn't been shunned out of those precious ivory towers that they're afraid to step on the other side of. I think they're wrong about that. And I, for one, am committed to being relentless on this point. If we concede, if we give up the things that make us human, there's no point to living. We've
Right,
lost everything. And
right.
I think you're relentless on that point too. And I think that we need to keep going. And I think we need to keep speaking, because if we lose not just our right to speak, but our interest in doing it, our ability to do it effectively, compassionately, empathetically, then there's no space for freedom to thrive anymore. And you have such spirit on these points, and I just can't thank you enough for joining us today. And please stay relentless.
Well, listen, we're closing out. And so if I can just say,
Please.
if I'm going to be staying relentless and if I still have sparks of optimism, it is because of people like you. And I'm not saying this, in a gratuitous kind of way. I think on the cover of your book, somebody wrote that are you are a light in an encircling circle of
Doom, I think.
yeah, so where's that? And so you are. People will say, I'll be having conversations, say, hey, isn't there some woman, you're a professor or something, and she got punted just because she disagreed on some of the health stuff? I said, yeah, that's really happening. And you need to look at what she's saying. So thank you for what you're saying. Thank you for being willing to give up your entire career. And thank you for being one of those points of light, keeping us out of darkness.
Thank you for today and for leading our country and for staying committed to it. It's unspeakable what that means. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks for hanging out with me today. If you enjoyed watching this video, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to the democracyfund.ca/donate.